topic is off limits. It's July 19th, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness.
Whatever comes after this second Trump administration, whatever is left of the resistance to the power structure that existed and opposed Trump, whatever that is, we are going to see it come back with a vengeance in 2028. That is my prediction. I don't necessarily speak for Jeff, but we're going to look at some polling data that shows that it looks like, or it's increasingly feeling like, the second Trump administration is already approaching lame duck status. If Democratic support for policies and positions means anything, the major initiatives that the second Trump administration came in on are, or have become, they weren't 6 months ago, they didn't poll negatively, but now they poll quite negatively. We're going to look at support, or as we'll see, predominantly opposition to Trump's initiatives on immigration and on the now effectively moribund DOGE efficiency, rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse, and shrinking the size of the managerial state. We're looking at data from an Economist YouGov poll that was conducted earlier this week. Respondents were asked about whether they would like to see expanded, kept the same, reduced, or eliminated 6 different governmental departments. And I'm going to read the results as a net of the percentages who wanted to see a department expanded, and subtracted from that the percentages who wanted to see it reduced or eliminated. So a positive rating here indicates that the population wants these departments expanded, and a negative reading means that the public wants these departments shrunk or eliminated. We'll start with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and that department, whose namesake invokes the idea of shrinking the size of the bureaucratic state, that is by far the department that most Americans want to see reduced or eliminated. It comes in at a negative 21 reading. The second worst performing department is ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That comes in at a negative 9. The third worst performing is the Department of Homeland Security, which comes in at an even 0. So the public effectively wants DOGE shrunk, ICE shrunk, DHS kept the same. And then the EPA is the next. It comes in at a positive 14, FEMA at a positive 17, and the National Weather Service at a positive 32. You can see outside of government agencies that are tasked with defending the homeland effectively, or taking a scalpel to the administrative state, outside of those departments, the public sentiment is towards governmental growth. Now we'll look at a series of questions about illegal immigration. The first one asks respondents, which comes closest to your view? Either that illegal immigrants take jobs that Americans don't want, or illegal immigrants take jobs that are wanted by Americans. 57% of respondents say that they take jobs Americans don't want, and just 25% of respondents, so 1 in 4 respondents, say that illegal immigration takes jobs away from Americans, with the residual saying they aren't sure. So by a more than 2-to-1 margin, the public perception is that illegal immigrants are needed for jobs that putatively would otherwise go undone. This is the crops rotting in the field canard that we have heard for decades now. Anytime anything looking like immigration restrictionism comes into play. The next question is, should ICE deport illegal aliens or illegal immigrants who have not committed any crimes while in the U.S. other than entering illegally? Just 32% say that ICE should deport them. The majority say no, 54%, and the remainder say not sure at 14%. So fewer than 1 in 3 Americans say that ICE should deport illegal aliens who are in the country but haven't done haven't committed any other criminal activity other than broaching the borders in the first place. To the question of whether illegal aliens should have the right to go to court to challenge their deportations, 57% say yes to 30% saying no. And so practically, if that were to actually have to happen before ICE could deport any illegal aliens, the idea that there would ever be mass deportations that wouldn't stretch years and decades, given how backed up the court system is and how weak the enforcement mechanisms are to ensure that those who are given scheduled court dates actually appear for them. That is already a big problem with asylum claims, where they come in, they make the claim, and then there's a court date to get it processed that's 6 months down the road, and the illegals who come in seeking asylum don't show up for the court date, and there's no further follow-up. There isn't documentation on where they are, and they have effectively come into the country even though they were initially apprehended. And so the same sort of dynamic without a concerted effort, really beyond the scope of what I can imagine the federal government doing, without a huge change in the infrastructure to process all of those court cases. Again, if we're talking about 7-figure deportations, which is what we will need on an annual basis to come anywhere close to making a dent in the population, that means millions of court dates and corresponding lawyers and judges and appeals and everything else that would utterly drown the process in legalistic red tape. Regarding general public sentiments towards how immigration is currently being addressed, the question asked was, quote, "Do you think that people in migrant detention centers in the U.S. are generally treated either too harshly, about right, or not harshly enough?" 5% say not harshly enough, 29% say about right, and the remaining 66% say either too harshly or not sure, with 47% saying too harshly. So the large plurality of Americans saying that immigrants in detention centers now are being treated too harshly. To the question of whether or not the U.S. government should be allowed to send illegal immigrants to foreign detention centers, just 22% say that the federal government should be able to, 58% say it should not be able to, and the remaining 19% say not sure. Prior to Trump's second election victory, there was a lot of public sentiment expressed against what was perceived to be uncontrolled illegal immigration. And there is polling data, some that we talked about in previous recordings, that backed that up. But as is often the case, it just takes a little bit of the proverbial children in cages to turn public sentiment in the other direction. And that's what we see here. I'm painting a picture here of broad public opposition to the perceived crackdown on immigration that is currently taking place. And that perceived crackdown is targeted and not systematic to an extent where it's going to make a meaningful dent in the population of illegal aliens in the country at current rates. So I am being quite black-pilled here from an immigration restrictionist perspective, but I think justifiably so.
There's a lot there. Let me start with your description of the crops rotting in the field as being a canard. So I want to focus on that. What do you mean by it being a canard? Meaning that the perception among that 57% who believe that the illegal aliens are doing jobs that Americans won't do, and because the Americans won't do those jobs, if we didn't have the illegal aliens, nobody would pick those crops, and the crops would rot in the field, and the Americans' food supply would be drastically, seriously jeopardized, that you would no longer be able to affordably procure food. And Ness, I'm assuming that you're not in agreement with the 57% that these jobs that illegal aliens are doing would not be done by Americans, or Americans refuse to do the job. So first, is that true? And if you don't agree with that, then let's say hypothetically all the illegal aliens were deported. We somehow were able to remove all the millions of illegal aliens. What would happen? Who would fill those jobs? Would those jobs be filled? How would the food supply be affected? How would prices be affected?
The estimates are that about 40% of the workforce in agriculture in the United States is illegal, or comprised of illegal aliens. So definitionally, the answer is that Americans will do it, because still, even in a sector like this that is so heavily influenced and relies on, or it says that they rely on, illegal alien labor, still the majority is done by people who are in the country legally. And so there are people who will do the work. It's just they won't do it for the wages that the agricultural interests would prefer, because they want to maximize their profits. And so using labor that is subsidized heavily by the taxpayer, it is the very familiar Chamber of Commerce plan to privatize profits and socialize costs. There would be immediate disruptions, and then the price required to have those crops picked that would otherwise rot in the fields would rise, and at some point Americans would pick those crops. Automation, of course, is another avenue, and when agricultural interests are making the financial decisions that all businesses make, they look at the cost of labor versus the cost of investment to replace that labor, and as the labor costs increase, so does the incentive to mechanize. And so it would be a combination of Americans doing agricultural work for higher wages and agricultural interests making investments in mechanization. And if neither of those things were economically viable, then some of the less economically viable agricultural businesses would go under. And if it's framed in that way, if you ask Americans instead, do you think that if a mega farm can only survive by effectively utilizing slave labor, do you think it should be subsidized by the American taxpayer? The question is framed that way, which is a more accurate description of what is going on than I think the majority answer would be, that said interest should be allowed to fail. But most people don't think about these questions at anywhere near that level of depth, and I'm not criticizing them for that. It's understandable why they wouldn't, since there's so little that they can do to change the outcome anyway, which is something we'll get to when we talk about the Epstein case and what the public sentiment is there versus what is happening. But the first order effect is I see these people who are presumably illegal. They're brown and short, and they don't speak English, and they're dressed differently, and so they must be illegal aliens, but they're doing all of this agricultural work and lawn care, landscaping, and so if they just disappear tomorrow, who's going to do it? I think that's as deeply as people think about it, to the extent that they do think about it, as opposed to just giving the answer that they think will be the least problematic with their HR departments or with their children's teachers or their neighbors, or whatever other social concerns that they have that govern their behavior in a much more meaningful way than their abstract opinions on political and cultural issues that they can't really do much to change anyway.
So most Americans believe that Americans will not do many of these jobs that the illegal aliens are doing. So my question is, if the illegal aliens were deported and Americans stepped in to do these jobs, and their wages correspondingly increased to a level where Americans would do those jobs, what do you think those Americans are doing right now? Where would these American workers who would do these jobs come from?
Cleaned up drug addicts, teenagers, people on welfare, people who are long-term unemployed. The current labor force participation rate, that is the percentage of able-bodied adults between the ages of 18 and 65 who are currently working in the United States, is, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 62.3%. So more than 1 in 3 Americans, adult Americans, who are able to engage in regular work, so that's a number on the order of 70 or 80 million, are currently not working. That, you'll notice, is a significantly higher figure than the officially reported unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate only looks at people who say that they are actively trying to find work. So a lot of these people are going to be people who are independently wealthy, or students, or spouses of full-time breadwinners, or chronic welfare recipients who live off of the various programs that they utilize and have no intention of looking for work, and so therefore aren't counted in the official unemployment rate, but do count in the labor force participation rate.
So of that available workforce of Americans who could do those jobs, I think, unfortunately, you have to scratch out a big chunk of them. If they're drug addicts, they're not going to be without substantial rehab. They're not going to be able to just go out and work in the field for 40 hours a week. You have a certain number of Americans are incredibly unhealthy. I think there's a good chunk of that percentage that's not in the workforce. It would be physically incapable of doing these jobs. And then I think the best way to realistically do it, if we were to somehow be able to deport all the illegal aliens, and then we would need to use Americans to do the jobs that they're doing, I think you would have to combine it with massive welfare restructuring, getting to realign the incentives to where the Americans who are capable of doing these difficult physical jobs that illegal aliens are doing now, that they would have no choice. They would not be able to eat without working, and then combined with a dramatic increase in the wages for those agricultural jobs, I think that's the way it could conceivably work.
Well, sure, you're talking about a systematic change in the way that work would be done in many sectors of the American economy if immigration laws were enforced. I think your questions, your suggestions, which seem obvious and straightforward, if they were implemented, that this would have to be a multiple-pronged approach in terms of systematic changes that would need to occur. But just having the deportations in the first place that's kind of my point here, is that that's politically unfeasible. So including with that the idea that we're going to kick people off welfare and all of the horror stories that will correspond with any moves to reform welfare and all of the other attendant political problems, make those additional solutions to help even less politically viable than just enforcing immigration laws in the first place. And as far as the health, yes, I agree that America is in a health crisis, and to a significant extent, it's because Americans don't do work like that anymore. Instead, they just sit behind desks or stare at screens for 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and consequently in poor health. And if they started working in the fields instead of their do-nothing office space type of jobs, that there would be some physical struggle initially, but that 5, 10, 20 years down the road, Americans would be healthier than they are now, and they would be more able to do labor-intensive, physically demanding jobs. This is a familiar tactic that the ruling class takes against Heritage America when it comes to immigration. We're bringing in these illegal aliens to do the jobs that you don't want to do anymore because they're too physically demanding, and so Americans stop doing those jobs and they become unhealthy because they're not doing any physically demanding jobs. It is the cousin of the argument that, well, nobody's having kids anymore, and so we need to bring in immigrants to do the jobs that Americans used to do, but there aren't any Americans being born. And of course, bringing in that cheap labor in the first place is one of the reasons that Americans have fewer children now than they did in the past. And so that's often the bait and switch that is pulled. It's, hey, these immigrants are going to make things better. They come in, and then it's, well, we can't get rid of these immigrants anymore because they're doing all these things that make our lives better.
Something else you mentioned in the polling, Ness, was the majority of Americans who at least abstractly believe that an illegal alien who's set to be deported has the right to due process. And that's a phrase that has been weaponized, because due process means many different things in a lot of different contexts. It's obviously known to Americans most by its appearance in the Bill of Rights, that the Fifth Amendment, that people have the right to due process of law. But supposedly, I had not heard this before, but supposedly due process applies just as much to non-citizens as to citizens. If that's the case, I think there has to be some sort of change, because that's just not feasible to provide the panoply of due process rights that Americans get to any illegal alien who just crosses the border. And as soon as they cross the border, they instantly have the same rights to due process that Americans have. It's just a big reason why we have the problem we have.
The wording of the question was just whether or not illegal immigrants should be able to challenge their deportations in court, but that I think you correctly read as the whole panoply of due process rights. I suppose that would be like a minimal version of it, just challenging it in court.
I think a reasonable comparison is if somebody invades your property, you have a piece of property and somebody steps onto the land and you seek to remove them. The common sense explanation would be you don't have to get anyone's approval. You can remove them from your land yourself. Versus if that person who steps onto your land gets due process, that essentially means that they can just take up residence on your property, erect a tent, start fishing, start living on your property, and you can't do anything about it until their, quote, due process rights are adjudicated and they have the right to appeal. And of course, if that's the case, it's going to be months and months until they're actually removed from your property. And then you multiply that by millions and millions, and you can see the huge problem that America faces in actually dealing with this mass illegal invasion.
Additionally, there's a big asymmetry in the resources and efforts that are required to enforce immigration, or in your example, to enforce your own property rights, compared to, especially in the case of publicly provided lawyers, to defend, to allow the due process to be granted to either the illegal alien or, in your example, the squatter, effectively, that it costs the illegal alien, it costs the squatter very little compared to how much it costs the entity trying to enforce sovereignty in the case of immigration, or your own property rights in the case of an individual property owner who has someone unauthorized come and start living off their land. And so if that squatter is simply told that he can no longer do it, and he doesn't have to pay for the defense case and the appeal, and in the intervening 3 or 6 months was just living off the land, and all he has to do is be legally required to get off the land, well, then he just goes somewhere else and repeats the process again. There's a parallel here, at the risk of being accused of comparing illegal aliens to terrorists. This is a dynamic that's in play with so-called terrorist activities, say, in the Middle East or in other less developed countries, where this is something famously that Osama bin Laden grasped very well, that for tens of thousands of dollars, terrorists are able to cost Western countries tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars. And so there's a similar asymmetry of resources at play, where it costs much more to enforce immigration laws and property rights than it costs the people violating them to violate those rights, especially when there isn't punitive criminal punishments that are associated with the violation of those rights. In the case of illegal aliens, the worst thing they're looking at, well, for the most part, prior to some of these deportations to foreign prisons, but prior to that, the worst they were looking at for taking the risk of coming here is just being sent back to where they came from. So the only costs associated are with travel.
I think another parallel could be drawn between how, at least in the United States, many municipalities, now there is a diversity in how states and counties and municipalities across the country deal with the issue, but of homelessness, where there is, again, that huge asymmetry that Ness was talking about, and a homeless person squatting in a homeless encampment near a creek, or near, often they're top 3 desirable characteristics or traits that they look for is proximity to a highway, proximity to a body of water, and proximity to a homeless shelter. And so result is that they squat there, they get hassled maybe every once in a while from a police officer who oftentimes doesn't really want to deal with the problem. So essentially they just have to go move somewhere else. And then they return, or occasionally they'll get a ticket and they'll show up to court and get a slap on the wrist, or they'll get, instead of any sort of punishment, they'll get free referrals to organizations that are supposedly going to help them get a job or find a place to live. And so, again, it's just an example of the bureaucracy that we have in place is just woefully ill-equipped to deal with the problem. And what's frustrating about illegal immigration is you don't need any new laws. All it takes is the will to enforce the law. But unfortunately, even a lot of Trump supporters are unwilling to do or to contemplate or to condone what actually needs to happen to actually deal with this problem in any real way. And I think, as an outsider looking in, the reality is that there has to be harshness, there has to be fear, because even if you had rigorous enforcement, it's going to be even if you lined up everything, and we'll talk about the big, beautiful bill and the supposed funding for ICE and immigration judges, but even if you ramped up the infrastructure needed to carry out mass deportations, I think with the numbers, it would still be difficult. And so you have to rely on self-deportation. And the Trump administration has at least ostensibly taken steps to encourage self-deportation. They're offering plane tickets. They're offering one-time cash payments to illegal aliens who voluntarily repatriate. So I think you combine the carrot of that with the stick of things like alligator Alcatraz. You create a spectacle. You create a fear. I think, whether you like it or not, that would be the most important thing, is to make illegal aliens, to the extent that you can, make them afraid that anytime they're walking down the street, for instance, I think that's why anytime they're walking down the street that they're in danger of getting picked up and thrown in a van and shipped to some third world country and never being heard from again. I think that fear is perhaps is the reason why I guess these ICE agents are now wearing masks. I think there is a fear that the Trump administration is trying to project, and I think that is in service of creating an environment in which illegal aliens are voluntarily self-deporting. And that was a big component of Dwight Eisenhower's Operation Wetback in the 1950s. The numbers, and I don't have the numbers, but Ness will give me the numbers, but a big percentage of the number that Operation Wetback achieved, the number of deportations that the operation achieved, many of those were self-deportations because of the environment and the perception that the Eisenhower administration created.
Yeah, in the case of Operation Wetback, the estimates are that between 60 and 80,000 were forcibly deported, and then another in the area of 600 to 800,000 voluntarily left on their own. Of course, we don't know exactly how many left on their own, but the estimates are that it's on the order of 6 to 10 times as many voluntarily left as were forcibly removed. Jeff mentioned ICE agents wearing masks. That was a question that the Economist YouGov also asked about in the survey that we referenced previously. And for the sake of brevity, I didn't mention it, but I will here since he brought it up, to the question of, do you think immigration and customs enforcement officers should be allowed to wear masks when making arrests? Just 36% say yes of Americans and 52% say no. So a majority of Americans express opposition to ICE agents being able to do that. And as far as the idea of instilling fear into illegal aliens, well, if you're going to have a law and order society, that is salubrious. That is what you want a society, an ordered society to look like, where people who are blatantly violating the law should be in fear that they're going to be punished for doing so, because if they're not, then there's no point in having the law in the first place.
And opponents of any rigorous enforcement of immigration law, opponents of deportation, will often bring up the emotional appeal that this is separating families. And I just have always thought that's such an absurd thing to say, because anytime you arrest someone for committing a crime, you're separating families. So the implication is that if the enforcement of a law will result in a parent being separated from their child, then the law shouldn't be enforced. And while we're just getting things off our chest, the other thing, the pet peeve of mine is you'll hear defense of these illegal aliens. Well, they're just coming here for a better life. They're just as if, and that you'll hear, I even see like interviews with illegal aliens, and they're saying, I'm just coming here to work. I just want a better life for myself. And as if that's a justification, because somebody is coming here because it benefits them, because their life is going to get better because of it, as if that's supposed to be a compelling reason for not enforcing the country's immigration law.
I think if we get to the essence of what you're getting at, this is what opponents of the carceral state, as they will characterize themselves, will say effectively, that if punishment for violations of laws inconveniences those who are being punished, then the law shouldn't exist. And that's effectively what you're saying. Well, if it's better for me to, all I want to do is better myself to make my situation better, well, there are all kinds of laws that could be violated in service of that. And so it just becomes an arbitrary question about what laws are being enforced and which laws aren't being enforced. And so if that is the sort of society that you have, and increasingly we do have one like that, it quickly devolves into anarcho-tyranny, where there are laws, but some of them are enforced and others aren't. And they're enforced when convenient for the powers that be, and not when they're not.
A couple weeks ago, on July 4th, 2025, President Trump signed the Big Beautiful Bill into law. And there's been a lot of debate on that bill as it relates to Medicaid funding and how many Americans will no longer be able to receive Medicaid, or the ones that do receive it, it might be harder for them to qualify for it. And there's other aspects, but we want to focus on the immigration-related aspects of that bill. So the law includes $150 billion in new defense spending and another $150 billion for border enforcement and deportation. The bill increases the funding for ICE from $10 billion to more than $100 billion by 2029, making it the single most heavily funded law enforcement agency in the federal government. And I'm drawing from the Wall Street Journal for this information. And just 2 Republicans in the House and 3 Republicans in the Senate voted against the bill. All the Democrats voted against it, and then all the rest of the Republicans voted for it. And so presumably with all of that funding, assuming that the Trump administration can competently allocate those funds and use them judiciously, it would appear that all the resources are there to actually carry out mass deportations. And so it will be interesting to see. I'm hoping that Trump is giving carte blanche essentially to people like Stephen Miller, who I believe has his heart in the right place in terms of genuinely wanting to carry out mass deportations. It's too early to say, only 2 weeks out from this bill, but it's something that we'll be covering very closely. And I think I'm generally more blue-pilled than my co-host Ness, and so I take the good news where I can find it. And we're getting some early indications of how the Trump administration is going to be spending all that extra money that ICE is receiving. As we mentioned earlier with Alligator Alcatraz in southern Florida, a facility in the Everglades has been retrofitted or converted to be able to house illegal aliens. I think that is something that the Trump administration is going to seek to replicate among red states throughout the country. I'm thinking Texas would be an obvious choice due to its proximity to the border. But there's even talk of the mountain state, West Virginia, being amenable to holding large numbers of illegal aliens. Because, again, drawing from a Wall Street Journal article that was just published today, July 19th, it's titled "Newly Flush with Cash, ICE Races to Build Migrant Tent Camps." And so the Trump administration officials have identified limited detention space as one of the major choke points preventing them from stepping up deportations as quickly as President Trump has promised. They hope a new $45 billion for detention through the end of his term will help them get to 100,000 beds by the end of the year, up from roughly 40,000 when Trump took office.
The once again aforementioned poll also asked respondents if they supported the creation of that so-called alligator Alcatraz facility in Florida. 36% of Americans supported it, 51% opposed. I concur that Stephen Miller and probably Tom Homan's hearts are in the right place. I think realistically they have 18 months to get this done effectively, and I think after that 18-month period, I imagine the midterms are going to be a bloodbath for Republicans. And so if it's not already effectively a lame duck presidency, I think by 2026, it will appear to be one. And however effective immigration enforcement is from 24 to 28, of course, it's cliched, but it's cliched for a reason, to say that all of that can very immediately be undone by a subsequent administration, whether it be a Democratic administration or a non-Trumpian Republican faction, a Chamber of Commerce, non-MAGA faction of Republicans back in the White House. If the Trump administration's approach to immigration increasingly looks like it's running into little d Democratic opposition, that is nothing in comparison to how the public views how the Trump administration has handled the Jeffrey Epstein case. This same poll that we've been drawing from asked respondents whether or not the government should, quote, release all the documents that it has about the Jeffrey Epstein case, unquote. 79% of respondents said yes, just 5% said no. A separate poll asked what percentages of Americans thought that the story surrounding, quote, accused sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, unquote, how important it is. This poll was conducted yesterday, so July 18th, and 58% of Democrats say very important compared to just 32% of Republicans. So here is another black pill, because those figures are almost exactly reversed from the figures that were given when a poll was done in 2019, when this was seen as a Republican issue to harp on. And now that Trump has effectively done a 180 and about face on the Epstein case and everything surrounding it, now a significant number of Republicans are taking that Trump lead, and now by a 2-to-1 margin, it's Democrats who now think that getting to the bottom of the Epstein case is what's important. So an Emerson poll back in 2019 found that 46% of Republicans say that Epstein was murdered, compared to just 26% of Democrats saying so. And though the question wasn't exactly the same as the ascribed importance of the case, I think it's a pretty good proxy to read that if you think today the case is a very important one to get to the bottom of, it is presumably because the official narrative about Epstein committing suicide is a false one, because he was actually murdered. And so we see 6 years ago, by a 2-to-1 margin, Republicans were the ones more concerned about Epstein. But now that, taking the lead of the Trump administration, that the Trump administration is saying that there's nothing more to see here, case closed, it was just a guy having sex with kids, and there were a bunch of them being pimped out, but they weren't being pimped out to anyone, and so there's nothing else we can see here. Taking that lead, now we have 2-to-1 Democrats more concerned about the case, and that looking at it that way reflects poorly on Republicans, specifically on the Trump administration, turning this into something that was just politically expedient at the time and for reasons that we can speculate on is no longer perceived to be expedient now. But the inverse, of course, exists with Democrats who didn't care about it in 2019 because it was perceived by them to be politically expedient for attention not to be given to Jeffrey Epstein. But now that it looks like it is expedient to do so, a much larger share of Democrats express concern about the case.
I don't have much to add on this topic. I feel like others have articulated everything. I've explored this topic to death, and I don't have much to add beyond summing up my feelings via a meme that I came across. It's a square with 4 squares with different Trump administration officials superimposed with text. So the first one, you have J.D. Vance. We need to release the list. Next, you have Pam Bondi, the Attorney General. The list is on my desk. Then you have Kash Patel, head of the FBI. There is no list. And then lastly, you have Trump. The list is fake and made by Obama. And Trump famously said in 2015 or 2016, I could go shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose any supporters. He seems to be having that same mindset now, to where I can basically gaslight my supporters and completely reverse a position that I held just a few months ago and gaslight them into thinking that my own supporters into thinking that they're crazy for wanting the Epstein list. And I think that theory that I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue theory is being put to the test. And there's, I think, pretty solid evidence that much of the Trump base is not buying it. They're not letting this issue go. And apparently Trump has ordered Pam Bondi to request that the courts, I believe it's in one of the districts of New York, federal districts of New York, which includes Manhattan, she has been instructed to request that the court unseal the grand jury testimony. So a grand jury is convened. That's the preliminary step in a lot of jurisdictions to bringing a criminal case. The first step is very low bar to get through grand jury. Grand jury essentially says there's enough to proceed with at least a prosecution. And so all of the records that were gathered and presented to the grand jury back in 2019 when Epstein was arrested for the second time, presumably a lot of those records could be released to the public. We'll see if anything happens. And maybe I'll reveal my ignorance or my naivete, but I just recently understood at least the theory on how this blackmail operation run by Epstein would have worked. I think I had just assumed that Epstein had obtained compromising material, photographs, or video of men having sex with underage women, and I assumed that it was a covert operation to secretly blackmail these men, versus it kind of was explained to me, and this actually makes more sense, that it was actually a willing thing, that these people were willingly compromised, because if you want to be involved in some sort of conspiracy, the best way to convince your handlers that you're never going to turn on them is to give them compromising material on you, so that they will know that you're never going to betray them.
In our enlightened secular age, we often collectively turn our backs on the accumulated wisdom of the past, but there is a pretty conventional adage here, which is about making a deal with the devil and then the devil coming back to collect at some point. And so here it is the devil offering power, worldly power, to people who take this offer. And in so doing, you are given all that the prince of this world is able to offer you. And the only thing that you have to give back in return is a promise to never turn your back on the devil. Because if you do, then you will be destroyed. The most alpha men in society already have access to the most sexually attractive women. I don't think that it is a natural proclivity for most powerful men to get their rocks off on underage women. These Playboy types can, and this is one of the reasons I think they hate Trump so much, because he did just that, can get all of the action they want from physically attractive women. And so just offering that isn't enough to ensnare the most powerful people on the planet. But one of the ways to becoming said most powerful people on the planet is by signing this deal with the devil. And I think Jeff got right to the heart of how the operation worked. I think the motives are mixed to some extent, though. I don't want to entirely let the perpetrators off the hook in terms of their deviant desires, because I think there is also underlying this more on the case of the Epsteins of the world rather than the, say, Bill Clintons of the world who partook in this activity, but the ones who pervade it in this way. I think there is a sick thrill in exploiting and destroying the most innocent. And so just to remark briefly, we're talking about here more the political ramifications of the Epstein case, but I would be remiss if I didn't give my opinion briefly of what we see here. And I think that while Pizzagate may have not been factually true, I think it was directionally correct. And I think that, say, a character from The Simpsons in the 90s and 2000s, Maud Flanders, being mocked for her signature rhetorical question about, won't someone please think of the children? And that was mocked and belittled. But I think there is a real truth there, that those who are opposed to the power structure really are wondering why the ruling class tends to think so little of the children. And again, I've kind of flirted with the spiritual aspect of this, but this is not something that is new. This is something that goes back all the way to the Canaanites in the Bible and Moloch and the god of sacrificing children and destroying innocence. And rather than trying to recapitulate what was articulated much better this week on Tucker Carlson's show in the interview he did with Daryl Cooper, I think you will get a deeper look at the psychology surrounding the Epstein world and that of the force that rules the planet in a way that is more than you might have bargained for if you're not the type of person who is willing to take that deal with the devil. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.